All right, seems like I'm on a roll in terms of book reviews. So today I want to review the book Apocalypse Never: Why Environmental Alarmism Hurts Us All by Michael Shellenberger. Picture of a polar bear in the front. I think I came across Schellenberger because of his more recent book, San Francisco. He's came out with, I think, these books a year apart. San Francisco came out maybe a year ago, and Apocalypse Never came out, I think, in spring of 2020. And I watched a couple interviews with him, and he talked about it, so I decided to buy the book. Apparently, this book didn't make as much of a splash as Apocalypse or as San Francisco has, but and I haven't read that one yet, although I have it. And I was really surprised how good this book was. Now, he takes pains at various parts in this book to lay out his liberal credentials. Now, he specifically, and I've seen this more recently, does describe himself as a liberal, and it might actually be fair to say at this point he's something close to a classical liberal. But if you go back in his biography and in his intellectual journey, it would have been much more accurate to call him a leftist or progressive. This is a guy who, as soon as he finished high school, or even before he finished high school, moved to Nicaragua to join the Sandinistas, right, and to learn Spanish, and spent time in favelas in Brazil, learned Portuguese, founded charities to fight climate change, was involved in some peripheral capacity in the Obama administration. Basically a super left-wing guy, super activist left-wing guy, not just a guy who, I mean, he's old enough that he wouldn't have been posting on Twitter and stuff. He's before social media when he came of age, but who went out there and did things, like would move to other countries, live in poverty, not on purpose. I don't think he thought, I want to live in poverty because I'm a hermit or I have some kind of aesthetic, monkish, but just I want to go help the Sandinistas, and that means I'm going to end up living, in not very good conditions. And it seems that during the Obama administration, he worked in a company that was trying to promote renewable energies, specifically wind and solar, and eventually he came around to the idea that wind and solar are just not effective enough. Not that they have no place, not that they're worthless, but they're not energy dense enough. You can't produce enough. You need a huge amount of space, and it's just not reliable. There's so many problems with it. And for him, it seems like there's a bit of a red pill, and you can see this with a lot of the environmentalists. You can tell the ones who are humanists with the ones who are misanthropes or just complete closet socialists, and that kind of linchpin, the litmus test, is how do they feel about nuclear? Because if you're really worried about CO2, and one of the points of the book is that maybe we should be worried about it, but that it's not necessarily a catastrophe. It's a very similar thing. I was actually surprised. A lot of what he reads and writes sounds a lot like Alex Epstein, who is an objectivist, very explicitly objectivist, and I think it would be safe to call him a libertarian. He might be pure enough of a pure objectivist that he may not like that label, but he definitely is. And yet they come to very similar conclusions. And I noticed in Alex's book has actually got a blurb from Schellenberger, so happy to see that they're aware of each other. But if you're really concerned about CO2, if you're really concerned about having cheap energy, well, we do have a scalable. There's two that are very clean and very reliable, and they are hydro and nuclear. Now, nuclear has some environmental problems that people don't like, and it's also not very scalable. There's only so much hydro potential that a given drainage basin can have, and in places like the United States, we've kind of got as many dams as we can have. We can't expand it that much. Now, there are other places in the world that their hydro potential isn't even close to reach. So there's lots of parts of Africa. I think he gives the number, something like 3% of Africa's hydro potential has been reached, whereas in the United States it's more like 75%. So hydro is definitely something that's possible, but nuclear can be expanded hugely. It's safer, and it has a much lower environmental impact. In terms of emission, both hydro and nuclear are essentially zero once they're built. There's obviously hydrocarbons that are going to be used in their construction and in their maintenance to a point, but not very much. But what you'll find is that Epstein and Shellenberger both talk about fossil fuels and their applicability, and Epstein is explicitly like a cheerleader for fossil fuels, but he'll admit he's the biggest fan of nuclear. That nuclear is cheap energy, it's reliable energy, and it's clean energy. And yet, the vast majority of environmentalists hate nuclear. They absolutely hate it. And the only real plausible explanation for this is some kind of misanthropy. They don't like humans. They don't want there to be cheap energy. And you can tell, and they go through it, that this idea that cheap energy is bad because it would contribute to human flourishing. If we have reliable, cheap energy, there's going to end up being more people, and people are going to consume more, and that's bad. And what we really need is to live less, to go back in time to where we're using 10 times less energy than we currently are. And while that sounds good to a lot of people in the abstract, if you know what that actually means, it means your standard of living completely collapses. It means you're going back to basically third world status. And one good thing that Schellenberg does is he takes time. He goes to Congo, right? What we used to call Zaire, but now Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, and he talks about, he interviews people, and the fact that they live in subsistence agriculture. They have to work all day, every day. They have to worry that their food is going to get stolen by animals, by baboons or elephants even. And they have to spend hours and hours and hours every day logging and hauling wood and burning it, and he comes up with this number that's about 5 million people a year die from diseases and other problems associated with wood and dung burning. Because people who aren't using fossil fuels, they're not using electricity. They still have to have fuel. They have to cook. They have to have heat. Well, they burn biomass, usually wood, and also very often dung. Okay, well, that's extremely unhealthy. Schellenberger goes so far as to say he never has campfires. He just refuses to burn wood, period, just out of principle. And when you look at it from the perspective of people living like that, and there are about 1 billion people who are living like that, it's hard to tell them, well, that's how everyone should live. And there's something highly, I don't want to say racist, but hypocritical to speak to someone where you have all of this industrial power at your you expend all this energy, you have the benefits of fossil fuels and nuclear power and everything else, and then tell somebody in sub-Saharan Africa, yeah, you should definitely not have coal, you should definitely not have oil, you should definitely not have electricity, you should just live in a teepee. I mean, and it gets that bad where there are people who talk that way. Now, these people are tweeting about it on their computers, flying around, going to Ibiza and whatnot, but then they'll unironically say things like that. So another interesting thing about the book is he kind of starts many of the chapters with a little vignette where he paints the picture as understood or perceived by most people, and certainly by most environmentalists. So he has a thing on saving the whales, and he talks about how whales were getting killed by the millions, they were getting slaughtered, their populations were declining, and then in 1975, some intrepid environmentalists in Vancouver went out in a boat and they tried to stop them, and that was how Greenpeace started, and then they lobbied and some of the governments around the world banned whaling, and boom. And then he breaks it down. So that's not really what happened. What really happened was oil happened, and oil destroyed most of the demand, because the main reason people were hunting whales throughout the 19th century was to obtain spermaceti, to obtain whale oil because it was cleaner and burned brighter than other types of candles and other types of luminary fuels people were using, and the development of kerosene and the exploitation of oil reserves, uh, drastically reduced the cost. It made it uneconomical to whale. People still did whale for other reasons, but the demand went so far down that it's been alleged, probably with some accuracy, that John D. Rockefeller indirectly saved the whales, and he goes into the whaling had already declined. And when you got to the point where states started to ban it, they were banning it because it wasn't important in their economy. It was a freebie, right? And the idea that it all happened because of Greenpeace is a complete myth. And he does that basically for every chapter, and it's pretty interesting. Another thing he talks about, the idea is not, he's not saying that there aren't problems. All these people agree that pollution is a problem, right? But and so Schellenberg even talks specifically about litter. He goes, the reason that there's a giant patch of plastic floating in the Pacific is because we don't, parts of the world, especially India and China and other third world places, don't have really good refuse collection. So garbage just ends up going in rivers. I mean, sometimes it's deliberately dumped there. In fact, frequently it's just deliberately dumped there. But even when it's not, if it ends up on the street, eventually it washes down and ends up, getting drained by some river into the ocean. Whereas in more first world countries, that stuff will go to a landfill where it's more manageable. Right? And you think that's a real problem. And many of the other things that are other forms of waste are problems. Habitat loss is a problem. And this is where the idea of energy concentration comes in. If you don't have fossil fuels, if you don't have nuclear, then you have to use biofuels. Well, then you're going to have to chop wood, and I don't know, thousands or millions of acres a year are felled just for fuel, whereas an oil rig does not fell an entire forest, and it removes trees from like an acre or two, and that's it, right? And it redounds much more than that, because with the cheap energy, with electricity, then you can start to have factories, and then you have people who make their living not through subsistence agriculture but from working in a city, and so you can have more people in a smaller area. Living here in New England, you drive around, there's towns obviously, but outside the towns it's forest, and there's forest everywhere. But if you pay close attention, none of it is old growth. The soil in New England, for the most part, is not very good. Some of the river bottom areas are a little bit more agriculturally sound. But when this place was originally settled, farmers covered everything. People were doing subsistence agriculture. When you hike through the woods, you'll find the old stone fences that they built when they cleared their fields. And you can look in old pictures, areas that are now completely covered in trees, back in 1890, 1880, 1900, were completely clear cut, and had been clear cut already for 100 years by that point. Because you had all these people making their living off the land, even though the land in New England is not very good. It's not very productive. The quality of the soil is very poor. The climate's not particularly great. Yes, you can grow, and yes, you can survive off of it, but it's not very good. But that's what you have to do to survive. But when factories start to open, when you can make your living, if you can make more money more reliably by working at a textile mill in Manchester or Concord or Nashua, then people will do that. I mean, they can make more. People choose to do it, right? People are not being... This idea of the enclosure movement that some anarcho-syndicalists, especially in the UK, have really grafted onto, the idea that the peasantry living in the countryside have this idyllic life that's so wonderful and is so open to progress. It's not, okay? To really... You're just going to be getting by, and if you're restricted to a single plot of land, you are going to have to very, very carefully crop manage and crop rotate. A third of your property at least is going to have to be fallow in any given year. And even so, if you don't manage that just perfectly, you're going to see dwindling returns. Every year you're going to grow less and less and less and less and less. And in the meantime, those with more capital, those with more with better land, even if people don't have better capital, if you're competing with everybody else and you don't have the best plot of land, you're just gonna be a victim of lower and lower prices. It's not, which is good. Lower food prices is great. This is when the anarcho-syndicalists are like, yeah, high food prices are good. It's a very hard scrabble life. It's very, very hard. And this is assuming you don't have a frost or a flood or a fire or a blight, right? These are all things that can and actually periodically will happen. You lose a certain amount to animals. Even today, I mean, I have family who are farmers, and they have these massive industrial fields, hundreds and hundreds of acres. But they'll even say, even now, the peripheral parts of the field, which are closer to the hedgerows, are consumed by deer. They're like, yeah, 25% of the crop in that 50 feet of perimeter will be consumed by white-tailed deer, just by one species in a year. Now, in the middle of the field, it's true that because of hunting, the deer are less likely to go there, and so sometimes you don't lose as much in the center. But this also factors in how big is your field. If your field is a mile by a mile square, then yeah, you have this huge area in the center that's not going to have too many losses. But if your field is only 1/10 that size, the entire field, right? So there's real reasons people would rather work in the city, despite the fact that 19th century cities had a lot of problems that today we would scoff at, right? We absolutely, the standard of living in 1900 or 1880 or 1850 in London or Manchester or Boston was very low by today's standards. And you could see somebody say, well, this is awful, all right? There's soot, there's noise, there's filth. Right now, by the mid-19th century and the last part of the 19th century, they were getting much, much better about things like sanitation. All these things were improving, but they were, necessarily they hadn't improved to the point where we are now, but it's a process. But that's not to say that living out in the countryside was idyllic. It was very, very hard life with diminishing returns, and so a lot of people would want to leave. And here's the thing. If you look at New England now, it's all forest again. It's all come back, right? A huge area that was agriculturally not very productive, but was necessary for subsistence of the population is gone. And now those people, obviously it's been 150 years, so they're all dead. But their descendants, their children, they didn't stay subsistence farmers. They moved to the cities, and maybe they had a rough life for a generation. And you can go and look at old pictures, again, using this example in Manchester. And it's a good example, too, because it's the first factories in the United States are to be found on the Merrimack River in Lowell and in Manchester and Concord. And some of those old textile mills are still there. I don't think the first generation ones, but maybe the second or third ones are still here. And, yeah, some of these people, they would have moved here, and their kids might have worked in a factory, and they might have gotten injured. Some of them definitely did. Some of them might have been killed. Things that, by the way, do happen in agriculture. People are killed in agriculture all the time. It's still one of actually the most dangerous things that you can do. I've heard stories of, in modern times of kids getting crushed by tractors and whatnot. Not to say it shouldn't exist or it's terrible, but it's like there's risks involved. But they're getting a wage. It's reliable. There's a chance for it to grow in a way that's not really the case with agriculture, unless you're able to be very capital intensive, or you just happen to have the best land, or there's some crazy flux in the market where food prices go very, very high. Your chances for advancement are very low. You basically would have to become not only a laborer, subsistence farmer, but also an entrepreneur on top, which is, the only path to true riches really anywhere. It's not an easy path, and to become an entrepreneur is also to take a lot of risks, some smaller, some greater, and you can forgive people who would rather not do that or can't do that, right? If you don't have the savings or the credit, then you may not be able to do capitalism. All this is to say, it's not a trivial thing for there to be reliable electricity, cheap electricity, power in cities and factories, because it draws people out of the countryside and allows those areas to be rewilded, which is what has happened in much of the first world. I think it's something like 25% of the deforestation of the previous 500 years has been undone in the United States and in Europe because people have urbanized and they've left the cities. But if you compare this to Zaire or Brazil, it's the opposite, because we have not as much urbanization. We don't have enough cheap energy. We don't have reliable energy. So people have to live by growing yams and rice and lentils and heating their house with wood, which means they have to, hike out into the forest and chop down trees. And by the way, if they want to get some protein, they're not going to get it from a factory farm. They're going to butcher some chimpanzees, some gorillas, or whatnot, right? And who can blame them if they're going to starve? So it's parts of this you can become, the cliche term would say quite based. But the other thing is all the challenges that are out there. CO2 is changing the climate, is kind of what they're going off of. But the idea that this is going to be a catastrophe is quite limited. And here Shellenberger and Epstein have very, very similar kind of rhetoric and points. One of the other things that one of his other vignettes is he kind of breaks down the IPCC report. And, these reports are massive. They're thousands of pages long, and then they'll pick somebody to write a summary. And the thing is, these summaries are often heavily editorialized, and basically, so people have resigned because the editorials that they produce, these summaries, which are the only things that the media will read, no one's going to read the whole report. It's available, you could, but nobody does. You can basically completely mischaracterize the study. So, for instance, if you listen to AOC, she's like, well, we're all going to die in 12 years. One of his vignettes is where he traces that. Where does this idea that there's going to be an absolute catastrophe in 12 years? And so he contacts, the Extinction Rebellion people who said that. And they're like, well, this comes from this report. And so he looks at the report, and then he talks to the scholar who came up with that. And what was actually said in that case, so this is kind of a good illustration. So on the end of what we see on television is someone like AOC or an Extinction Rebellion spokesperson saying, we're all going to die in 12 years. Like, the society is going to end. That's going to be it for humanity in 12 years. The kernel of truth there is that in some report that an academic said that because of sea level rise, it's going to be a catastrophe, by which he means population movements in some low-lying areas will become, quote, unmanageable, quote, unmanageable. And the scholar in question was thinking specifically of Bangladesh being a very low-lying area in the Ganges estuary, but also a very heavily populated area. He's saying, look, in the next 100 years, a few million people are going to have to move. They're going to have to urbanize and start to live in cities. And Shellenberger asked, well, okay, but it's true right now that every year a couple million people in Bangladesh move to the cities anyway, right? There's this rural to urban flight that's been ongoing in much of the world. In the West, in the United States and Europe, it happened, but much more gradually over the course of several generations, where in much of the third world today, it's happening over like 1 or 2 generations. But this academic admits this. He goes, yes, there's millions of people moving to the cities in Bangladesh now, and, quote, it's unmanageable. So what that is to say is he looks at the situation today and he says that it's unmanageable. Now, it's not. People are clearly getting by, whatever problems there are, and there are problems. They're problems that we can deal with. And that's the same descriptor that he's using for his forecast. This is, it's going to be unmanageable in the future when the sea level rises. And, I've heard Epstein point this out. We currently have 100 million people who live below high tide right now. Famously the Dutch do this, but it's actually not that uncommon. There's lots of areas where this happens. But the lesson of the story, though, is you have somebody saying, a situation that currently exists is unmanageable, and therefore in the future things will be unmanageable, right? So the status quo will basically continue. It won't be any worse. It'll just also be unmanageable. And then you have this twisted into, we're all going to die in 12 years. And you find a lot of that happening. So where the IPCC report will say things like, we don't know if there'll be droughts, and there's a low probability that we can't manage the droughts. We don't know if there's going to be floods, but if there are, we can probably handle it. We don't know if there's going to be rising sea level, but if there is, it's probably going to be something that we can handle because we can already handle tides anyway and whatnot. So that'll be in the report, but then in the summary that the news media reads, it'll say we're all going to die, and it's going to be a catastrophe, and blah blah blah. So again, very informative that he breaks it all down that way, that he goes and finds the original sources and just says this is the kernel that grew into this snowball that we're all going to die. And he points out that there's kind of like a spectrum. Using biofuels is the most polluting and the most dangerous and the least efficient. Fossil fuels are better, and nuclear is the best. Hydro is fine in some limited capacity. Again, hydro has limited scalability, but there are places where it works. There are other environmental problems with hydro too, and I think he would argue and agree that nuclear would be the preference where and when possible. May not be possible in certain societies, right? If you have a society where everyone's a subsistence farmer, where you're going to get people who are going to manage a factory like that, you'd have to train them all from scratch. But he goes into, so in Congo, there's this long talk about this idea of building a giant dam on the Congo River. The Congo River has a huge amount of hydro potential, and it can provide electricity for millions of people. And it's being opposed by charities who don't want rivers dammed because they like to whitewater raft, right? They look at a dam and they say, well, I would rather whitewater raft down that river. Okay, that's wonderful. Whitewater rafting's great, but we're talking about providing reliable and cheap electricity to millions of extremely poor people, right? I mean, who, by the way, because they don't have cheap electricity, are decimating the forests and the area where they live. So, and they can't work in factories because factories don't have any power, right? So they have to become subsistence farmers. So they have to clear the land and keep clearing more land because there's more people growing and because the land doesn't stay fertile for very long, especially when they're so capital intensive. So it's like this impulse to keep the river raftable for people who are elite enough to have that as a hobby is actually hugely detrimental. So yeah, the basic gist of the book is that climate change is very manageable. Neither one of the authors, and I'll do a review on Epstein's book too, is that there could be problems. There probably will be problems, but the power that we get, the energy, our ingenuity makes it that these are very manageable problems, and the benefits far, far outweigh the costs. And yeah, I actually really, really like Shellenberger. Now, you can find lots of interviews with him. He's done a lot with his more recent book, San Francisco, which is more about homelessness and drug abuse and things like that. I'll probably read that too eventually. But Apocalypse Number was a really good book, and I think it's also one that if you know somebody who is an environmentalist or one of these, we got to do anything and, we're all going to die, I think it's a really good palliative for that because he definitely comes from the left. He explicitly now considers himself liberal. He calls himself like a secular humanist. He believes in humanism. He's kind of grown into somebody based in the Enlightenment in a way that I think has hugely, helped his character and what he has to put out there. But he can talk the talk and walk the walk. And right now his big thing is there's one remaining nuclear. Oh, here's another thing. Very strange, very ironic, I guess you could say. The fight against nuclear power has been waged by a bunch of environmental agencies, but many of these environmental agencies are getting funded by none other than the fossil fuel economy, including coal power plants. And the hypocrisy here is quite ridiculous. So he talks about Tom Steyer, if you remember him flooding the internet with ads back in 2020 when he was running for president on the Democratic ticket, and he's a huge coal tycoon. Most of his money's from coal. Same with Bloomberg. Same with the Joe Davis, the longtime governor of California. All these guys own oil, they own coal, and then they fund like the Sierra Club, and then they come out and say, hey, we got to stop nuclear, even though nuclear is demonstrably cleaner and cheaper than fossil fuels. And I have nothing against fossil fuels, but like there's a spectrum, and nuclear is the best. And yet they're trying to stop it. If we had continued building nuclear power plants at the rate we had been in the 60s, then the United States would be almost 100%, at least in terms of electricity, on nuclear at this point. Now, we would still need fossil fuels for transportation, for jets, and for most of our cars. It would still have a role. It would be much cheaper since a lot of it wouldn't be going to running the grid. But there's been basically a moratorium on this. The federal government has regulated so much that no nuclear power plants have been opened since the late 70s. There's one that's almost going to be opened in Georgia, and it takes decades longer and billions more because of the regulations, which specifically exist to stop them from being built, essentially. And it's to our great detriment. So anyway, it's a great book. I think it's definitely worth checking out if you have never heard of him or never looked into it. Also probably a good one to give to somebody who maybe could have some perspective on the issue. So, all right, thanks very much, and I'll talk to you all soon. Goodbye.